Welcome to Climate Change, the Facts 2020 interview series brought to you by the Institute of Public Affairs, Australia's leading voice for freedom and hosted by me, Jo Nova. Climate Change, the Facts 2020 is the fourth edition in the Institute of Public Affairs Climate Change, the Facts series. You can purchase a copy of this hugely popular book online at climatechangethefacts.org.au. Polar bears and lately falling walruses have become the pin-up stars of the missions to save the Earth. Susan Crockford is a zoologist, an evolutionary biologist, a prehistoric archaeologist, and an expert on polar bears and walruses and mammals and things like dogs and evolution. So amongst many things, and indeed I was surprised to find she's even written books on the thyroid hormone and the origin of species, just to give you an idea of how expansive her background is. Now, somehow through all of that, she's ended up being the one to talk about polar bears and the other side of the story, to break the myths. Because these polar bears and whatnot are being exploited, as we all know, for the last, even down here in Australia, thousands of miles away from the nearest polar bear, we are still inundated with messages about how they're all dying. There's only a few hundred left, practically all gone, aren't they, Susan?
Yeah.
And so it's great that she's here today to talk to us about the myths of the polar bears and about what it means to be an academic who dares to talk about the real numbers and the real problems in the way that falling walruses, for example, may have happened before. So now, Susan, so to start talking about that incident with the falling walruses that Netflix and David Attenborough and the others were using a few years ago, I had no idea that walruses could fall. But tell us about falling walruses, because you know, they made gruesome images.
Well, they absolutely, they were gruesome images. And the reason that they were included in this film and made such a big deal about is because it had such a strong emotional impact on people. It was horrifying, absolutely horrifying. But what really happens in nature is that there are a few locations where walruses haul up on beaches where they can actually get up to cliff tops. And they just do. They'll wander off. And if something spooks them when they're up there, because they really like to huddle together really close, if something spooks them, they can just fall off the edge. And so
what kind of things would spook? I mean, some of these walruses, they weigh hundreds of kilos, don't they?
Oh yeah, like a ton. Like a big male will weigh.
What spooks a 1 ton walrus?
Well, they're actually pretty easily frightened. So an airplane overhead, a drone, a polar bear, just some startling noise, will just, if it sets one of them off, then they all start, what they do when they're frightened is head to the water. And so even when they're on a beach, apparently one of the ways that polar bears hunt walrus is to get them to stampede towards the water when they're just hauled out on the beach. And they're almost sure to trample, some young ones on their way. And that's easier for the polar bears than trying to actually confront one of these big animals and try and kill it.
And there were some polar bears there probably on that day when the footage was shot of those walruses falling off the cliff.
Well, it took a long time to sort of piece together what had happened. But ultimately what we discovered was that what had happened was that about 20 polar bears had ended up getting up to the top of the cliff, and they came from the backside and had spooked some of the walrus off the top of the cliff. And by the time, and that was shown in a BBC film, that was in November, I think, of 2019. But the film that was shown in April only showed the walruses falling off the cliff. Well, it turns out the walruses falling off the cliff happened after that event, when the walruses were still really highly excited and something else disturbed them, maybe just the fact that there were still polar bears around.
Or the drones that the BBC...
Or the drones, or all the film crew or whatever, yeah.
Yeah, so just extraordinary. So the film crew would have known that those walruses were not being scared by a lack of sea ice and climate change.
No, absolutely, because they had seen the whole thing happen from the very beginning. And that was what was not apparent until the end of 2019. For more than a year, they had been insisting that there had been no polar bears involved, there was no polar bears around. So they were flat out lying because they filmed the whole sequence of the polar bears, sort of herding the walruses off the edge of the cliff.
So the nicest possible interpretation we could give of this is a kind of noble cause corruption, where they knew full well that those walruses were chased up by, perhaps herded by, the polar bears over the cliff, because, McWalrus on the rocks is maybe an easy meal for the polar bears. And they didn't say anything because, after all, they know climate change is really bad, and it'll be okay to just do little white lies about what happened and pretend that really it was a lack of sea ice that made these walruses go all the way up a long hill and then fall off the other side, which is so improbable. It's just hard to
Well,
believe.
I mean, if you were going to be very, very generous, I mean, I think that you might be able to suggest that David Attenborough was not aware of all the facts when he put his name and his voice to narrating those films, that he wasn't aware of everything that had gone on at the time. But certainly the film crew who had been interviewed at the time and insisted no polar bears were involved knew full well that they weren't telling the truth.
Yes, extraordinary, isn't it? And yet, where were the news journalists asking questions? David Attenborough surely should have known enough about the biology of these creatures to ask the kind of questions of the film crew and wonder what would happen.
You would think so, but I think that's where your noble cause corruption comes in, is that they don't bother to ask those kinds of questions. If someone comes in and gives them a narrative that fits their mindset, then they're not asking questions.
So we get to exploit these animals and their deaths and use it as a cash cow for fundraising for their own salaries, projects, beliefs, or just to give them kudos at dinner parties.
Well, and certainly it was apparent from some of the things that were happening in around 2017, which is the year that this incident actually occurred. It's not when it was released on film, but that the World Wildlife Fund, which was a co-producer with Netflix for the first film that we saw, that they had come to realize that focusing completely on polar bears as an icon for, the narrative of global warming was really getting them not quite what they were after. It was starting to backfire a little bit, partly because
fatigue.
Yeah, polar bear fatigue. The bears weren't dying off the way they were supposed to, but when these films were released, all of a sudden the narrative coming out of World Wildlife Fund was that this was the new icon for climate change. So they were really making a very concerted effort to, I don't know, to shift, but certainly to add another icon to the Arctic story, to sort of balance off what was going on with polar bears.
And I think from their point of view, donations just flow when you get people crying in the streets, watching these poor animals suffer these dismal fates, which, as you've pointed out in the book, has happened so many times before, that this is one of those boom and bust natural horrible cycles. It just is.
Yes, and that what much has been made of the fact that the walrus are coming up on the beaches in high numbers, like 100,000. Well, the thing is that
100,000. This is like a herd of buffalo. 100,000 one-ton animals who are very cumbersome and slow out of the water, though, unlike buffalo. But I mean, that's extraordinary just to imagine.
No, it is.
Number.
But these huge herds only come up on the beaches when the absolute, like the absolute numbers of animals in the population is high. So the fact that they're coming out in those high numbers is an indication that they're thriving, not an indication that they're suffering.
And does it have anything at all to do with sea ice?
No, because, well, obviously they're not, they can't come up on the beach if the beach isn't clear, you know. So what they're doing is using the beach as a feeding platform. And in all these instances, the idea seems to be that they're telling people that the walruses are stuck there. In fact, that's not the case, that they're using the beach as a feeding platform. And what they're doing is going, and you can see them in the pictures, they're going into the water to feed on clams and other invertebrates on the bottom of the ocean. And so they're just using it as a place to rest in between bouts of feeding.
Yeah, so, I mean, not that I know much about walruses, but just amazing to think of those kind of herds. But also in terms of the sea ice, then, is it good for walruses to have less sea ice or more sea ice? Do they have a preference?
Well, I mean, it really is looking like there certainly is so far no evidence that the walrus are suffering because of lack of ice. And there's good reason to believe that, in fact, they're doing better because of less ice, for the same reason that polar bears in that same area are doing very well.
And that's interesting, isn't it? That mammals whose body temperatures presumably are not that different to ours might like a slightly warmer climate or slightly less sea ice, because after all,
it's more the lack of ice, because when there's less ice in the summer, there's more primary productivity. So there's more production of plankton. And when that happens, that's what the clams and all the invertebrates feed on. So if there's lots of food for the clams, it means there's going to be lots of food for the walrus. And so what we've got is a situation that's different from what happened in the 80s. And let me just backtrack. In the 70s, the population of walruses was quite high. And what happened was they eventually ate their way, ate all of the food in their habitat. And some of them started to starve. And so the numbers of walruses started to decline. And there were reports of starving animals at that time because there wasn't enough for them to eat. But right now, it looks like their population is even higher than it was in the 70s, but we are not, and it has been high for at least 10 years, but we're not getting any reports of starving animals, and the population still seems to be maintaining that high, and that suggests they're getting lots to eat.
If climate change has any effect on walrus populations and polar bears, it's to make them more prolific.
In this particular case, yes.
If we look at the data and if that matters.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
So speaking of that, we've got a graph of polar bears. It was figure 1.3 in the book on page 28. And the numbers on that graph and the last point there, I'll hold it up, but hopefully they'll drop the imaging for people to see. They're just astonishing. The increase in polar bears in the last 10 years is quite remarkable, but it's, of course, been increasing since they stopped hunting them in the 60s, hasn't it?
Yes, and that's what has happened with all of these marine mammals like whales, sea otters, fur seals that were hunted to very low numbers. And as soon as they were protected, the numbers go up. So it shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone that this happened. But what has happened over the last 10, 20 years is that the polar bear experts who are, their job is to deal with the issue of conservation, they have been constantly underestimating the population size. When anything comes up, they tend to lowball any of their estimates, and it's really confusing, and also misleading.
Because you were saying in here, there's a couple of zones where the polar bears are not perhaps prolific as much as elsewhere, but generally and all around the world in total numbers, the total numbers of polar bears are up, 4 times since the 1960s?
Yeah, something like that. And that they could be. I mean, the official estimate is about 26,000. But it's, by my calculations, it could be as high as 40,000. if you look at the areas in Russia where there has been no surveys. So, there's nobody's gone out and counted them there. And so what the polar bear experts are saying, oh, well, and so they just give those areas a count of 0. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Like,
No.
why would you assume, just because you don't have specific information, that there are no polar bears there?
And of course, we saw footage of polar bears wandering through cities in Siberia.
Yeah, and
through apartments, even in Siberia, there was footage the other year, which they said was hungry polar bears coming in. But you would say, I guess, that it means there's just so many polar bears that they're...
Well, exactly. And so we know that it's prime polar bear habitat. We have some information from other areas that are similar in habitat. We have population counts for those. I would say that it's a plausible and perfectly acceptable thing to do is to use the areas where we know we have a number and make a kind of best guess estimate. And that's where I get my number of about 40,000, is to put some figure on those areas in Russia that the polar bear experts refuse to say anything other than 0.
Okay. And can I ask, why were people hunting polar bears in the 60s? I mean, was it a product that they would sell, polar bear skins or something, or is it just because they didn't want to be eaten by polar bears? And
oh no, it was very much a commercial enterprise for the skins, and before that, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they were also hunted for their fat in the same way that seals were. When the whalers ran out of whales, when they got short in the Arctic, then they started to take walrus and seals and polar bears for their fat, because a polar bear in prime condition can have a couple of 100 pounds of fat.
Wow.
So, it is a reasonable source. And so they were hunted really heavily in that period.
Well, and we're all glad that that's stopped so that the numbers could recover. But clearly they're not in any danger of dying out now. But what is in danger of dying out, it seems to be, is academics who are free to discuss these kind of numbers, because you're an adjunct professor at the University of Victoria, right?
That's
and they
correct,
have cancelled that. They've cancelled you effectively.
Yes.
Adjunct professor doesn't cost a university anything, does it really?
No, it doesn't. And I had been an adjunct there for 15 years without any problems, and no indication from anyone that they were unhappy with my performance.
So no scandals. There's no issue where you didn't put up your data, where you were caught doing something you shouldn't be doing. It just, they decided that they couldn't afford to have you as an adjunct, even though it costs them a car park space or a library.
No, not even that. Not even that. All I get is access to the library.
Wow. And I mean, we saw this with Bob Carter and James Cook University, that they gradually took back his adjunct status. They took back his email. They cancelled every little tiny bit they could, because what they were really cancelling is a reputation, the ability to say adjunct professor. So for research grants and things like that, you're now unable to apply for research grants to do more work.
That's correct. So
are you still doing
on any
research?
topic? On any topic. So not even on my thyroid hormone research, which is what I did my PhD thesis on at that university. I could no longer do any kind of research or collaborate with another academic on that, because I no longer have a university affiliation.
And that's not a controversial topic, but it's you that's been cancelled, not,
Yes.
So you now can you do research? Are you being funded in any way by anyone to get some research done, or is
no, I don't have any funding at all, and so it really is a matter of if it came up to see, I would have to find an affiliation at another university. I would have to find another university that would be willing to give me an adjunct status.
And you didn't have problem before getting research funding, not until was about 2017 when this started, this kind of...
Yes. And so, I mean, when they refused to renew my application for the adjunct, I mean, they didn't give a reason, and they refused to. They said, we're not, we don't have to give a reason.
And they refused to answer questions when the
yes,
National Post
absolutely.
asked questions as well.
Yes.
And Donna Leframboise was trying to get answers from them. Still, they don't feel compelled to answer.
Yes, nothing. And so very unlike some of the very public situations we've seen, like for Bob Carter or for Peter Ridd more recently, where the university has been at least upfront about what they're doing. My university refused to acknowledge any of the reasons behind what was happening. But I really was convinced that my work on polar bears was behind all of this, because 2 years before that, I was evicted, canceled from the Speakers Bureau program. And that's a program that the university runs for professors, adjunct professors, graduate students who go out into the community and give lectures to school groups and to community groups on various different topics. And I had been giving lectures in that capacity.
So how many schools or lectures and community groups would you do? I mean, was it a popular thing for schools to bring you out and get you to talk about polar bears?
Absolutely, yes. And so I talked about dogs, I talked about archaeology. I actually, I had been so often asked about polar bears that I finally put together something for school children, because I had been talking to adult groups about polar bears, but we had so many teachers asking for a lecture for children, because the middle school curriculum deals with Arctic ecology. And so it was, a topic that was very pertinent to them, and they really were anxious to have someone who in the community who could come and talk to the students about that. And I did, I think, about 10 presentations to middle school classes, and they were always very well received.
But
and as far as I knew,
activists complained that it was not balanced, because you weren't just reciting the litany, perhaps, and the activists got to the university.
Yes.
The university really didn't have much of a backbone or a spine, and the ability to just say, you know what, this is academic free speech, and we can't control what our professors say. If you find a mistake in her talk, let us know. And there was none of that.
No, none of that. No one asked to see my presentation. No one sat in on any of my presentations. There was nothing. It was just, no, that was it. And so not only was I not allowed to talk about polar bears, I couldn't talk about anything.
Yes, because you're now
not my PhD research, evolution.
The Speakers Bureau dropped you too, because then you don't have a professorship to protect them.
Well, no, it was the Speakers Bureau dumped me first, and then the department dumped me afterwards. And so that's really what led me to believe that, in fact, the department dumped me because I had become too prominent, too vocal. Somebody had got to the administration, and the decision came from up high, and nobody could do anything.
And because years ago I wrote something about Mitzie Taylor, who also works with polar bears, who I gather, and he was fairly much exiled from I think it's called the Polar Bear Study Group, which he chaired for something like 30 years.
Group,
and they pretty much just cut him out, despite 30 years of polar bear research was his main specialty. Yes. And he was cut off in about 2009, I think.
Yeah.
So even then, the pressure in the academic world in Canada was so strong against anyone who dared suggest that polar bears might be doing okay, that he was cut off from those kind of things back then. I remember thinking at the time, it was just astonishing, this exile.
No, exactly. Yeah.
And I mean, in the book, there's this example of of one of the guys who's still on the Speakers Bureau book, who goes out and talks about climate change, but has a background. His BA was in like Chinese languages or something like that. But that's okay, because he's saying climate change is bad, presumably. and reciting the same permitted propaganda litany that anyone's allowed to say, no matter who they are or what their qualifications are.
And so really there was no really didn't seem to be any oversight into what people were doing or saying. And indeed, I had been giving lectures to the community, to adults, for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years with no kind of backlash whatsoever. So I believe it was somebody from outside came, and the university claims it was a parent, but I don't believe that's true.
What, one parent complains and that's enough?
If someone called and said, I'm a parent, how would you know if they were or not?
Well, and does it matter if one parent is offended? But
yeah.
But that's all it took. So I think what we're seeing is a much deeper problem with our universities. Is there any rescuing our universities, or do we need some other funding model for research where people like you and others can still get funding outside of a university system? Because if universities won't stand up for their professors, what hope is there that we're going to get real and accurate research from university? And just the same case with Peter Ridd at James Cook Uni, we now know that we can't trust any research from any announcement from any worker, probably at all Australian universities, because none of the other universities stood up for him either, because we know that people are too afraid to put out any results which don't fit the permitted meme. And they can obviously look at what happened to you and look at what happened to Mitch Taylor and Peter Ridd and to Murray Selby, and there's a whole string of research that clearly you'd have to be a very brave young researcher to say anything that was outside the...
No, it would be death to your career. And, you can see why they don't say anything. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why I chose to speak up, because in a way, because I was at some level a step back from the academia, in that because I was an adjunct, I wasn't, teaching full time, and I wasn't employed, that I had a little bit more freedom. And I think it's one of the reasons why they really felt they had to take me out, because I was being too effective. And, it was the only thing that they could do, was to silence me, because I was making too much sense and people were hearing me, and they had to put a stop to that.
Well, and because they lose every free debate that there is to lose. So the best thing to do is not have a debate at all. So, well, I mean, and you were saying that the people in the department or other departments were a bit astonished at what happened to you, or was that part of it? I think I read in here about other researchers at UniVic who were astonished at what happened.
Well, really, I haven't had much in the way of feedback from most people.
Okay.
I certainly have had feedback from the international academic community, because when I went on a tour to give lectures in Europe last fall, it was really heartening to see how much support that I had. But I'm not really sure that most people at my university, really know what happened.
Until you're on the end of the cancelling and the cancel culture, it is easy to kind of pretend, well, she must have done something wrong, or she must have, and it's not until people actually step outside that zone. I just, this week or last week, Howard Brady, who also wrote in the book, and I think your chapter is number 1, I think his might be number 2, he was banned from doing a speech at an ANU. And there, some of the other lecturers were they astonished, appalled, and it's like, well, welcome to the real world. You didn't realize that there's been this expulsion of everyone who says anything against the meme at university. So for them, I think it was a wake-up call that happened. But you don't get any evidence that that's the case at University of Victoria or elsewhere in Canada.
Well, it's really and certainly no one's coming to me. A few of my close colleagues. But, I don't think they have the wherewithal to think of how they might even do anything about that.
This is it. We don't have a discussion about this, do we?
No.
And we talk about bullying that goes on at schools and with kids, but the adult kind of level bullying is so strong. We're not training people to stand up to it, to recognize it, to deal with it. And it seems to be so pervasive that,
Yes.
the entire university system in Canada said nothing.
Yes. No, exactly. I know. And it was really appalling. And I know that Donna was really upset on my behalf. She was appalled. And, she lives in another province and some of the experiences might be a little different. But as I said, really, especially having watched what Peter Ridd went through, that the university was at least transparent about, at least about why they said they were.
Well, that's right. He wrote
upset.
Satirical emails, you're not
whereas
allowed
my
to.
university would not even acknowledge what the problem
maybe the
was.
situation is worse in Canada than here, and it's pretty bad here. So
yeah.
Wow.
So,
and of course, you were at IKE last year.
Yes.
And the conference, which I spoke at the year before, and we had no trouble the year before, but apparently at the same center,
we had
which
a bit of
IKE
drama.
has used for years.
Yep.
This is a German group, free speech and whatnot, and the whole conference had to be moved like the week before or something. It was extraordinary.
Yes, and it was really quite an eye-opening experience. And there were some older German people who were in the audience for that, and talking to them at the break, the one woman said, "This reminds me of what my auntie talked about that Germany was like in the 30s. Because at that time, finally, when the conference got going, we had guards at the door, watching us. And she said that it was the climate. She said it was the atmosphere of feeling like, there was people out there to get you and people watching, and that you had to have guards. And, she was visibly disturbed by what was going on, and that kind of thing should be happening again.
Extraordinary. Yeah, I spoke to Wolfgang Muller, about the organizer of that conference, about that. He said for years they've been doing the conference there, the same one. They have advanced bookings the same time every year, and just extraordinary that now it's become so political, so unpermitted, that the whole conference got cancelled because a team of people were going to come to the front of the conference and do something, and we didn't even have police in Munich that would come and clear away everyone gave in. It's almost like a question of spinelessness amongst everyone, from university academics, speakers, bureaus, hotel managers, local police, everyone not willing to just say, it's okay and it's not dangerous for someone to just say their point of view.
Yeah. I don't know. I really don't know.
Well, happy to try and help share the story and the message. Good for you for being so brave to speak up when it's earned you nothing but, trouble. Yeah. And I presume you must have lost friends over this as well. And
and some of my colleagues that really I thought were friends and had been for years, I just don't see anymore. But
it's amazing what a test it is, isn't it? Yeah. That you find out who your real friends are.
Yeah, for sure. But it is important, and it's important that I continue on. It's important for science. It's important for young students to have a role model, to look to see that people are standing up to this, and no matter what gets thrown at them.
But how will university students at Uni Victoria, how will they get an alternate point of view? They're only being fed the permitted lines. Right? Yeah. So it's just about churning another generation out, trained to cry when there's a footage of a walrus falling off a cliff, which, as you describe in the book, has happened many times before. Yeah. It's one of those brutal boom and bust cycles that nature does. We get the same thing here with koalas, and nobody seems to realize we actually have plagues of koalas every now and again. And it's hard to even imagine the term plague of koalas. But yes, and they're actually normally very low density and spread very thinly. But when there is a mass koala death, it's because, like with the walruses, there's been just too many
Too many, yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, one of the advantages of actually having been doing this for so long is that some of the community groups know that I give lectures and people still call me.
Okay.
So I still get called for lectures, and you know, so it hasn't been severed completely. And I think that it's possible to build that back up again in some way if there are other venues. And it's one of the reasons for, you know, maintaining my blog, my polar bear blog, that's called Polar Bear Science. And that gives people a place to go. And I'm just going to carry on as long as I can.
Well, and so if people wanted to get you to come and talk to them, whereabouts are you based? So
in Victoria, I'm actually fairly near to the university in British Columbia on the west coast of Canada. But there's, you know, a contact page on my blog, and people do in fact contact me through that. And so it's possible to arrange.
And hopefully send you a few donations, because you don't get paid to do these speeches
no,
at community groups or schools.
And in fact, you know, there have been a few times when I have had to ask for donations, and people have been incredibly generous. And so I know that I have people out there who appreciate what it is that I do. And that really helps a lot.
It makes it possible for you to go out and talk to kids and help them to understand just how they're being used and exploited. And the polar bears and the walruses and everything else is being used and exploited to be a cash cow for groups like WWF, who don't seem to be too concerned at all about the animals, so to speak, since they're not interested in the actual data. And again, that's what I think I just mentioned last night or the other day about the wind farms and the effect they have on mammals. We're just finding out the effect wind farms have on humans. Has anyone even done any research on the effect of offshore wind farms on the mammals that go in the ocean? Has anyone even looked at what that does to them?
Yeah, I don't know.
How much does WWF or Greenpeace or Sierra Club or any of those actually care about those mammals? Shouldn't they be calling for that kind of research?
Well, you know, they bring in millions, and then they dribble out little bits of funds here and there throughout the Arctic to make it look like they're making some kind of a difference. And I think in some small communities they do, but not in proportion to the amount of money they bring in. It's a real pittance, you know, and I really think that if we could have a count of polar bears, you know, all at once, if we had all of these people who are saying that they are collecting money to help polar bears, well, that's one of the things that would help, is if we had counts of bears, you know, more or less at the same time. It's part of, you know, the problem is that you have one here and 10 years later you have one over here, and it's, you know, you never have a count that's going on at the same time.
Well, and as we found with penguins on the South Pole, they just up and move when conditions change, and people will say, oh my gosh, 100,000 penguins have gone, but they just turn up somewhere else.
Yeah, caribou do that as well. It seems to catch them every time by surprise.
So, look, it's been lovely talking to you, Susan, and it's well done for being so brave to say who would have thought that polar bear research would become so contentious or politicised. But, you know, thank you for being one of the brave people willing to speak up and discuss the things that no one else at universities in Canada seems willing to say.
Yes. Well, thank you. You're welcome.
The world would be a richer place if we had more of you, Susan.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Okay, good night.
I hope you enjoyed that interview, and I hope it has inspired you to pick up a copy of Climate Change, The Facts 2020. I cannot recommend the book enough. To watch the interviews in the series, or to find out more about the book, or to purchase a copy, head over to climatechangethefacts.org.au.